Hello, everyone.
Hey,
Today I'm joined by a very special guest. He actually runs a YouTube channel called Odd Compass, right? And his name is actually Tarun Sridharan. And so, how are you doing today?
hey, Basit, doing well. Just yeah, excited to jump in and talk about all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm really honored to have you here. And one thing I really like about your channel, like I have to say, is the animations and like you going into detail about like the different like eras that you talk about, like specifically about obviously like medieval India.
Yeah. I mean, I essentially have like certain topics of interest that I find that are a little bit more neglected subjects. Medieval
Yeah.
India is really neglected, which is why so much of my focus has been on that. Um, Traditionally, there's an enormous gap in scholarship when it comes to medieval India. It really, the way the narrative goes is Indus Valley, then goes through like the early states period, finally the Mauryans, then it just time skips all the way to the Guptas, and then it time skips again like 1,000 years to the Mughals, and then it goes British Raj, modern day. So
Yeah.
like yeah, there's a few things in between that people are aware of. I think the Marathas people tend to be sort of aware of, and that's kind of fit in there, coinciding with the Mughals. But for the most part, people have really limited understandings of medieval Indian history. So that has been my focus so far. But I am branching out to other subjects. But in general, just trying to find stories that haven't really been told, and I do try to find the human element. So, because the human element is what inspires me to do that kind of like deeper research. Because people tend to get a little bit upset by how long these videos take. But like you said, the animation and the research and like piecing it together into a narrative that people can understand and that will be appealing to someone who might not otherwise be that interested in that stuff. That's really, really difficult. And I need that human element to,
Yeah.
you know, justify that kind of commitment and investment. Yeah.
No, I like that. I like that. It kind of makes it a bit more like relatable and easier to understand when you add that
For
human
sure.
element. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Like a good example is I did a video on this queen, Rudrama Devi, and um, there's many different ways to approach it. I mean, if people are kind of curious about the process, like I could have gone in more detail about like specific like war strategies and um, things like that. Like I could have really filled up the video with things like that. But for me, it was really interesting to explore at least partly the psychology of what she might have been going through at the time. I mean, she was like a teenage girl when she was put on the throne.
Yeah.
In and like the fact that she was a woman meant that even her own cousins rebelled against her and like people she trusted backstabbed her, but she did have people on her side as well. So um I thought that was really interesting. I think that that kind of human story, and she was battling heartbreak because her father, who she was very close to, died, and her
Yeah.
husband died. And from records we have of third parties who were visiting her court in her later life, they actually talked about how much love she had for her deceased husband. So, like decades on, she never remarried as a queen. She never left
Okay.
any male heirs. So
Okay.
she could have ostensibly remarried and had a male heir. And that would have made sense for her politically, right? But she
Yeah.
actually chose not to remarry because of how much love she had for her deceased husband. So, and this is something like, it's not legend or it's not like a mythos that
Oh
was
yeah.
built up to like, this is literally,
Like history.
um, yeah, I mean, this is like Marco Polo wrote that. Like
Yeah.
Marco Polo was visiting on his way back from China. He took a ship
Oh no
and
way.
he had arrived in her kingdom and she invited him to stay in like the royal guest quarters or whatever. And he wrote about her kingdom, and one of the things he wrote about was how beloved she was, and how she actually never remarried and was very much in love with her deceased husband. So sorry, I went a little bit off track, but the point I'm trying to make is that knowing that what we know about how much love she had for her husband, to have lost her husband and her father in a single year at a time when there was rebellions happening against her reign and she was so young, you can just imagine how difficult that must have been for her, right? Like,
Yeah.
and for me, focusing the narrative in the beginning on that psychological journey was, I was hoping that, okay, maybe this will capture people's interest and like you'll be invested in her as a person. You want her to win, you know?
Yeah.
Um, so that's how I tend to think of these things is there is history, more detailed history to these things, but I think it's more important as a channel that's trying to capture an audience that, okay, let me take a step back. What I'm trying to do is I don't want people to watch a video and think this is the end all be all of this
Yeah.
subject. Does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
I don't think it's good to watch the video and think you know everything about that particular subject. What I'm doing is I'm giving people enough information that they have a good understanding of that story and the characters and maybe some information more broadly, but I want them to, if they're interested, to keep reading and to learn more because there's
Yeah.
only so much I can fit into a video, but it's enough to whet people's appetite. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I like that. You give them basically a good like foundation to start on and
Exactly.
obviously build on that. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, and I do try to give enough that you have something meaty to go. Like, you generally know the story and what's going on, but you know, like little details. Like some people might be interested in. I think I've talked about this in fact, speaking of that Rudrama Devi video, I think I talked about this. Like, we know from temple grants, uh, the economics of her kingdom, and like how we even know how capital formed and was used by various enterprises. And it also tells us about inequality in her kingdom and like how caste was viewed in her kingdom, like how she'd broken down a lot of caste barriers and had created an economic situation that was much more favorable towards investment. And we know all that from temple grants in copper plate inscriptions. So like, I give you a taste of that, but like you could actually go and like read the translations
Yeah.
of those copper plate inscriptions and find all these like interesting details that would give you like someone who's really obsessed with history might want to do that, you know?
That's true. That's
Um,
true.
but like if I included that in the video, that would be like a 30-minute video. Like each thing I'm like, wait, let me like show you these translations and do that.
Yeah.
But
No, I feel you. Yeah, that's for
yeah.
sure. One thing I do wanna, because I think you did make a video on like war elephants. If I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah, I
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
like that one because um, one thing I don't think a lot of people know is like because there's obviously two types of species of elephants, right? African and Asian,
Mhm.
right? Those are primarily the two. And obviously people don't know this, but Asian elephants are actually a lot easier to train than your African counterparts, right?
Mhm.
It's even said that you know Hannibal, right? The one who
Yeah.
crossed the Alps on Italy. It is said that supposedly that his elephant was actually from Asia, believe it or not. Yeah. So it's like crazy to think that an Asian elephant was actually going through like Europe, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's
And like
hilarious.
crossing the Alps.
That I mean, yeah, it is. It really wouldn't surprise me because you know elephants were like currency between kingdoms. Honestly, like
Yeah. Like absolute
if
tanks.
yeah, yeah, and if I recall, in I think it was in Chandragupta's time in Chandragupta Maurya,
Yeah.
he made a deal with Seleucus Nicator to marry his daughter in exchange for like he gave Seleucus Nicator like hundreds of war elephants to use in his
Yeah.
wars in the West. So you know, I mean, it really was something that had leverage. But over time, war elephants actually ended up being very like hit or miss. I think I talked about it a little bit in the video,
Yeah.
but like in ancient times, it was obviously like just this absolute advantage. And later on, it was still an advantage in certain battles, but it could be turned against you. I think I talked
Yeah.
about this. There was like a member of an invading army in Sindh, and he was like a fantastic archer. He's like a legendary archer. and the story goes that he aimed for the eye of this famed white elephant of the
Okay.
king of Sin, and it hit the eye of this elephant, and it went into a frenzy. He like sniped it from like half a
Yeah,
mile
that's
away,
pretty impressive
and
considering how hard that must have been.
yeah. I mean, the guy's. I mean, who knows how much of this is legend and how much of it is
Yeah.
real? But so the story goes that it enraged the elephant, and that elephant tore through its own ranks, causing like
Yeah.
havoc on the battlefield. So, I mean, and there's many examples of this in Malacca in Southeast Asia. The Sultan of Malacca had an elephant corps that met the Portuguese on land, and you would think these Portuguese and Indian spearmen would basically be screwed, right? But they had been trained in India fighting against Indian armies. So they knew how
Yeah.
to fight war elephants, and they knew how to get into formation, and they knew not to run. And they also knew exactly how to hit them and encircle them and confuse them. So the Sultan goes out on his like Royal Elephant Corps thinking that he's going to smash through these Portuguese regiments. But instead of
Yeah.
these like heavily armored knights with these pikes and stuff, they end up enraging the Sultan's elephant, who throws him off its back, and he gets like severely injured, and he has to be dragged away by his own soldiers. And yeah, I mean, like elephants were, I think towards the end, like they were still being used even into the 1700s and 1800s. But I think once you get into the late medieval era, you definitely see that they have iffy strategic consistency, and they were used a lot as like a status symbol. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's almost like if you think about it from a morale perspective, like your troops might feel like, oh, look at how powerful we are. We have these elephants on our side and stuff like that. So it might have an advantage from a morale perspective. But like,
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry, I'm going
Uh,
on these like long rants. I don't mean to take your
sure.
questions and like run with
No,
them
no,
as
it's
much.
fine. No, that's true because one thing I do know is that elephants are not as mobile as, say, like a horse, right? Or even like a
Mhm.
foot soldier. So it can be like a disadvantage at times.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they can't jump. So, like Indian armies used to just dig ditches and like trap elephants.
Yeah.
Um, there are like all sorts of tactics that they have for like avoiding those. Obviously, there's like tactics and counter tactics, and I could go into these things in videos. I think I did slightly in the war elephant video, but for the most part, I find military history interesting in broad strokes,
Yeah.
but I don't tend to be obsessed over tactics. You might notice that like sometimes I'll talk about battles and I'll just talk about the outcome of the battle and maybe like a
Yeah.
couple interesting things that happened in it. But there's channels on YouTube where their entire interest in history is like they want to go into
Battle
the,
tactics.
yeah, like
Yeah.
battle tactics,
Yeah.
like, which is fine. I mean, that stuff's interesting to me, but like, I don't know. It's just not the sort of thing that really excites
That
me.
you personally do. Yeah. No, I feel you. What's actually interesting is um obviously like how I said, like Asian elephants tend to be easier than African elephants. There was actually a time, I believe I forgot what it was, but it was a battle in Egypt actually, where for the first time, and I think it was the only time in history where Asian elephants and African elephants actually fought against each other.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And the surprising thing is that the Asian elephants, I think they're the ones who actually won.
I mean, that doesn't make sense if they're
Yeah.
more trainable and
Yeah.
easier. But so yeah, like I guess when it comes to topics, so I'm not a historian. I've just had a lifelong obsession with history. When I was like a little kid, uh, I'd spend time with my relatives in India, and like I remember I would ask my mom to like go to like the Delhi book fair, and I would go to the history section. I just like pick up all
Yeah.
of these like academic books, like Oxford University Press and stuff like that,
Yeah.
and I just like read through it. So like I don't know, just from a really early age, I've just been obsessed with history. I used to like read my school textbooks on history and just obsess over it. Like, um, I think it's just like I think people who like history just tend to like good stories.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I think that's what a history basically is. It's a good story, but obviously it's like it's a real story, or at least it's supposed to be, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
I
I
do want to
mean,
ask.
yeah. Oh,
Oh,
go
you were
ahead.
saying?
Sorry. I was gonna say that. that's well, you know, that simple comment is quite powerful because history, especially when we're talking Asian history, and more specifically South Asian history, so much of it is shrouded in myth and legend, right?
Yeah,
And there's a lot of inconsistency in records as well. Um,
yeah,
and some histories have just been better preserved. Like a good example of it is Chinese history. It's been like really well preserved. Japanese history, it's because they like wrote down everything. It was just part of their court culture to do that.
yeah,
Um, and so, like, say for example, you're trying to study Southeast Asian history. A lot of
yeah.
times you're relying on Chinese records, right? So,
Oh, yeah,
like,
that's very true. Yeah,
right. And like they do have their own local records, just like Indian kingdoms have their own local records and stuff. But sadly, like they either were destroyed during like various invasions or the colonial period where like a lot of families lost their wealth. And so families that used to maintain like private libraries or otherwise preserve these things for hundreds of years that just got lost, right? Or it got sold
yeah,
to like some British guy for cheap after this family went
yeah,
like bankrupt. And then
yeah.
like who knows, he misplaced it or just deteriorated in his, you know.
No, I like how you mentioned that because I'm sure you know about Alexander the Great and like how he was coming to India, right? And um how he fought like King Porus and all that, right?
Right.
Everything we know about King Porus and like that part of like India actually is from Greek accounts because there's
Right.
unfortunately nothing really from like Indian accounts that like tell about who he really was, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, yeah. No,
I
that's
mean,
actually a really good point.
it's true. Yeah. And he could have been an okay guy. It's funny because he's painted as like a despised figure. But um, if you think about who's painting him that way, because he was painted as a degenerate by the Mauryans as well. But the Mauryans are the ones who wanted him ousted too. So it's like,
Yeah,
of course they're going to paint him badly. Even the Indian
yeah,
records are going to paint. But like, and God, I find that so fascinating. Speaking of, like, when power gets transferred, what I find fascinating is they criticize it. They criticize the past power, but the way that it's worked into history is like you almost can't go too far because they don't want to delegitimize power itself. So, for
yeah,
example, like these Chinese dynasties, this thing is fascinating, but like every dynasty, they would rebel and take over. And like every new dynasty was basically the result of some rebellion, right? And
yeah,
you would think that they would paint the previous dynasty as like horrible, villainous, and like that's why. Nope.
yeah.
They would literally say that dynasty's time just came to an end and the mandate of heaven went to this new dynasty, right? Which is
Okay,
carrying
yeah,
on the legacy of that dynasty. So it's
yeah,
almost like that dynasty couldn't be trusted to carry on its own legacy. So like a
yeah,
new one had to do it. And the wild thing is that every new dynasty, they like uh the court would like have scholars write tracts on like why did that dynasty fail, like scholarly tracts. So there's literally like scholarly tracts after the downfall of the Tang dynasty, where the Song dynasty talks about like why did the Tang dynasty fall, and we have a good understanding of why the Tang dynasty fell because of the Song dynasty's scholarship on it. And they were like
yeah,
really objective about it too. They weren't like, oh, they're villainous, and of course we had to come take power. Like they don't go
yeah,
that far. They don't really try to overly legitimize themselves. So I do
yeah,
find it interesting because like the Morians like paint Porus like an asshole. But they paint Porus as like, degenerate, and they kind of agree with Greek accounts of Porus and how people view
yeah,
him. But it does make you wonder if like Indian kingdoms never had that same sense that like the Chinese dynasties had of like respecting their predecessors to that
yeah,
degree. Um, and there's many reasons for that. I don't want to paint it like they just have a disrespect. It's very frequently they weren't even from the same region. Like they didn't might
yeah,
not have even spoken the same language. Like they might have so different ethnicity, different religious subset, different like
yeah. Or
everything.
even like
So
just like gain in general, like power, right?
yeah, yeah, just yeah, exactly. So like there's a lot of reasons why they might not have felt as close of a kinship to that predecessor. But
Yeah,
yeah, but anyways, so I do find it fascinating because like history is not that objective, and a lot of it is, even where we think we have an objective story, it's like so subject to so many biases and interpretations.
yeah,
So it's like, I guess like what I wanted to say in response to what you were saying is like, especially with South Asian history, where there's fewer records, so much of it is left up to interpretation. And that's what's scary. Like sometimes I'll read stuff and I'll just be like, wait, they're just like guessing here. They're just totally
yeah,
speculating. But if you write it really confidently, it comes across like a statement of objective fact, right?
yeah,
And there's power in that because storytelling is the heart of Asian history, because we don't have like reams of like scholarship to go through from like records from like, say if you're a historian of medieval Europe, let's just be honest, like your job is a lot more detail oriented. You're really like diving into like
yeah.
really specific records from like back then. But and a lot of Indian scholarship is like that, sure, but a lot of it is, there's like one record and it's just
Yeah.
like
It's
wild
actually a very
speculation
good
about what
point
it means.
because even like even if you go really back, like the ancient times, right, and you talk about like the ancient Indus, for example, there's not really much we know about them. Everything is just speculation. Like
Right.
it's like even like the language that's written on there, like we don't have like a Rosetta Stone, and like that can actually decipher what they're saying. It's all just speculation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that kind of speculation I think is true of a lot of ancient history in general. Like I don't know if there's any region in the world where like the ancient history
Yeah,
is like that well understood. For what I understand, even like something like, say like ancient history, our general perception is that Egyptian history is well understood, right? But what's fascinating is like, say Egyptian mythology, a lot of what we know is like scant records that the Roman Empire kept of Egyptian mythology.
yeah,
So like it's not even Egyptian records necessarily in a lot of cases, where like
that's true.
our understanding of these stories is based off some Roman scholar who was visiting and like was writing about it. And they might write about it, but they're like really biased against it, right? Like
Yeah, that's true.
I recall there's like Roman writers who refer to the Egyptians as like oh God, the term escapes me now, but they viewed them as kind of like
Barbarians.
wasteful, a bit
Okay.
wasteful. Like they viewed
Oh,
the Romans themselves as practical people, like industrious, practical people, and they viewed the
yeah,
Egyptians as having enormous amounts of wealth, but wasting it. Um,
yeah. That's
so
interesting because I remember on your channel, I think you did talk about how the ancient Romans and the Greeks they actually did once they like conquered Egypt, it was easier for them to trade with India.
yeah,
I remember you talking about that on your channel.
yeah, it's really fascinating. Like most of the Roman citizens of note in Egypt were Greeks in the Roman Empire who were like
Yeah,
working in Egypt. But it is, yeah, I mean, they were so practical. I mean, the Egypt, but the thing is, like, so much of that is our own perception based off Roman records, because like all they did was they just used Egyptian trade routes to India.
yeah,
So it's not even like, it's not like they developed new stuff. It's just
yeah,
they just took whatever the Egyptians were already doing. But it's kind of like pseudo colonialism, anyways. What the Romans did in Egypt, because I don't know if you've heard this phrase, but I think Augustus Caesar said that he came. God, I'm going to butcher this quote, but he like came to Rome. And it was like he left Rome a city of marble, but when he came to it, it was like a city of
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
wood
I
or
think it
something like
was
that.
something like I
Brick,
came.
maybe.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I know what quote you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm
I,
totally
I
butchering the quote, but
yeah,
um, essentially, he's just talking about how Rome wasn't actually that wealthy when
yeah,
he came to the fore, but When
Yeah.
he left it extraordinarily wealthy. But a big reason why Rome was so wealthy is because they were ruling over Egypt, and
Yeah.
they had essentially colonized Egypt, and they were
Yeah.
extracting its resources for the Roman Empire's benefit. So, um, you know, there's so many examples of like colonialism before what we consider to be the colonial era in the modern day, right? Like a lot of
Yeah.
people mistakenly think like the first piece of colonialism was like during the age of sail with like these modern European states. But like one of my videos, I talk about the Cholas in South India, like engaged in pseudo colonial enterprises in like Indonesia and Malaysia. So it's not like they went there because they're like, hey, we just want to like be friends with you. Like they came there so
Yeah.
that they could like manipulate their politics to benefit them economically.
Yeah.
So
No, that is mostly what history is. People just going out to like another land and conquering it. That's always what it
right,
is.
right. And it's fascinating how like so much of that is like symbolic, and
Yeah.
that there's a strange balance because even in the modern day, I don't know if you're really into like geopolitics, but there's this there's this idea that like states states grow and expand just due to the natural like incentive of like power begets more power, right? Because
Okay.
and generally speaking, like someone who's in a position of power either wants to maintain his position or wants to expand it, right? So like
Yeah.
there's like a natural kind of propagation of power and its structures. But as a general rule, uh, states tend to perform better when they are able to be administered more efficiently, and they're like more efficient bureaucratically in general, right? Like, and part of that
Yeah.
is like it's a lot harder to administer a massive state with that's very diverse than it is like a much smaller homogenous like state where you
Yeah.
like from like a bureaucratic perspective, you know how to govern those people, you know how to tax them, you know how to manage the markets better. Like they're so as a general rule, smaller states tend to be more prosperous on like from a per capita perspective, right?
Yeah. But that
So there's
makes
kind of
sense.
like, oh, go ahead.
Culturally, like you would be a little more. You would be more like you would have more knowledge on the culture just in general that you're like
Exactly.
governing
Yeah.
because you're from there. Like
Exactly. So,
yeah.
and I think like just taking a step back, of course, larger states can govern small regions really well too, because it's not like they're governing it from the center and like
Yeah.
completely, right? Like they have local governors and then their bureaucrats under them. They might even keep all the different like lords and bureaucrats in general there, but
Yeah.
just have like an additional layer on top of that. But every single time you add more layers, you add bureaucratic inefficiency,
No,
right?
that's a good point because even like for example the Persians or even Alexander the Great conquered so much land. They would have like something called a satrap, right? Which is basically what you're describing, right? And
Right,
that
right,
person would usually be from that area, but he would just be um he'd be loyal to obviously the emperor at the time, right? Whether it was Cyrus the Great or it was Alexander the Great, right? And that
right.
person would obviously like maintain that region and government under like
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
emperor.
Yeah. I mean, you can kind of see it's like fascinating because like anytime it's not like these empires are not trying to govern locally too. Like they are
Yeah,
doing whether they're maintaining the entire power structure or whether they're implementing some new structure, they still have like layers upon layers, like at this regional level, then at this local level, what have you. So it's not that those mechanisms aren't there. It's just that it's more inefficient because every layer of bureaucracy you add, there's going to be some inefficiencies that get imposed, right?
yeah,
So my point is that like from that perspective, smaller states tend to be better for the people in it, right? But there's a balance because if you're too small, you are at risk for being swallowed up eventually by a larger state. So then it kind of
Yeah.
like, then you almost need larger states just to protect the stability of your state. So it's like
Yeah.
that economic efficiency aspect gets pushed aside by the military efficiency aspect, right? It's like,
Yeah.
anyways, I guess my point is just that like I find that tightrope which powers need to walk, like whether historically or even in the modern day, this idea of like how big do you need to be really to maintain wealth, stability, and like, because a lot of times I'll read about these empires and I'll just think to myself, but what about the average person? You know what I mean? Because like it's
Yeah.
so common when you read about history, you read about this king or this lord or this general or this scholar. I mean, the scholar is like probably from some rich family and it has like court funds to use and stuff like that. Like these aren't normal people, right? Like so when they're writing, it would be like asking like Jeff Bezos what he thinks about Seattle. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
he's like, yeah, Seattle's great. But like then ask like some, maybe ask like a working class person what he thinks about it. Their opinion will be very different. But those people, their opinions are very rarely in the historical record. So you have to be
I
really
think there is
careful
a
and
channel
read.
on history, like they do talk about like the average person and like what they went through in that empire, right? Like the average Roman, or the average Egyptian, average Carthaginian. Like I've seen like some episode, I forgot who makes those videos, but that I know what you're talking about. It is actually very interesting what the average person's like opinion would be on, that said era.
Right, right. And like there, we even have some of those records in Asia, right? Like it's not like those records just don't exist, but it's just a little bit rare and it's just difficult to find. But um, I find that stuff fascinating because it's very easy to read about some like expansionist empire and think, oh, what a great empire. But okay, fair enough. It takes a lot of skill and political maneuvering, military maneuvering, whatever, to manage to, first of all, to create and then preserve a large empire, right? That's,
Yeah,
of course, and that's interesting in and of itself. But after a while, you read about all these empires, and then it's just like at some point you just ask yourself, you're like, yeah, but what did like some merchant somewhere, like what was the impact on them, or
yeah,
like some laborer? And I don't think it's necessary to do that every single time, but I do
yeah,
always try and take a step back and just think about. Sometimes I'll think about, okay, well, this empire did this, this, and this. What does that mean for, say, the merchants? What impact did that have on them? And I'll like try and do some research on that. And
yeah,
that led me down some really interesting roads, like because a lot of people, when they talk about, say, the Cholas, for example, and their invasions of, say, Southeast Asia or their expansionism in South India or whatever, like it's very easy to get caught up on like lionizing these kings as like these almost mythical figures and then like talking about how grand this empire is and all this stuff. And
yeah,
what I think is more interesting is like looking into the kind of like the dark stuff behind it. Like there are these super powerful merchant guilds that were funding their armies, and these guys had like massive amounts of influence on the throne, because
yeah,
they even used to threaten the king that they'll fund rebels if they don't listen to them. And like, so like these kings were like pawns of powerful merchant guilds. It's in some respects, not completely, but like we pretend like these mythical kings, like everyone loves them. And it's like, nah, this is like real politics happening at the time.
yeah,
Probably he has some enemies. This merchant who's like the head of some massive, powerful guild is like, comes to the court, throws some weight around in court and is like, hey, I need you to cut taxes on this thing. And he's like, well, if you don't, then that rival lord that you have on the outskirts, I'll fund him, and these guys like, so see, that stuff's really interesting to me because it's like, I hate treating historical figures like gods because that's so
yeah.
like common in Asian history. It's so ridiculous. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's true.
Like
Yeah.
Shivaji, you know Shivaji, right?
No, I'm not aware.
Oh, okay. So some people like they'll literally, they'll host a party for you if you say Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, like as though showing him great respect. Like there's some American or Irish YouTuber or something like that who uh, did like a video on the Maratha Empire, which is the empire to which Shivaji belonged.
Okay.
And he said through this video, it was a super pandering video, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
really pandering video. I won't name any names, but a big YouTuber. And in this pandering video, every single time he said this guy's name, he said Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, right? It would be like if I made a video about I don't know, a German emperor in medieval times, and every single time I said this man's name, I went Holy Roman Emperor, whatever.
Oh,
Like I
yeah.
don't know, let's just make up a German name, Sigismund or something.
Yeah.
The Grand Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund. And every single time in a 15 to 20-minute video, I had to say that every single time. And
Yeah.
in the comments, some like German nationalists are like, "Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for saying Grand Holy Roman Emperor. It shows how much you respect our German culture that you say Grand Holy Roman Emperor." Dude, this is what we have to contend with when we're doing South Asian history, you know?
Yeah.
You have people who have invested a portion of their identity in a human being, and they find it so difficult to conceive of these figures as humans, flawed
Yeah.
humans, maybe great, right? I like Shivaji was a great man. He was absolutely a fascinating figure, ambitious, intelligent, clever. There's many things you could say about him that are positive, but it's like they don't. Some people aren't happy with you treating him human. You need to treat him like a godly figure who had no moral failings ever. Who knows? I don't know from the record whether he has any moral failings, right? But are we going to pretend that he didn't? Does anyone ever born in the history of the world have no moral failings? Yet these
Yeah.
people can't conceive of their favorite historical figure having one. You know what I
That's
mean?
true. Yeah.
It's
That's a
absurd. I
good.
mean, it's ignorance, pure and simple, but it's an ignorance because we were talking about history as stories. But what I fear is that people use it as a delusion, like a fantasy story for themselves to make them feel better because we can't deny this. History is identity.
Yeah. That's
And
true. 100%. I like how you mentioned that. Yeah, it was honestly a really great honor to have you on here. And I'd love to do like another session with you sometime in the future.
oh yeah, for sure. Oh my God, I can't believe we burned through the time.
Yeah. No, for sure. Um, so for everyone that enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe. You know, click the bell notification, and until next time, peace.
Thanks.